In this workshop, we're going to take some time to talk about synthesis. If you've already watched the summary video and the analysis video workshops, this may be a little bit more useful for you. So if you have time, I'd recommend going back to watch those. But if not, these are also complementary ideas that can stand on their own, and you can watch the other workshop videos out of order if you'd like. I will talk about some things for synthesis in terms of previous videos, so that is why I recommend you watch the earlier content. I always like to start with an overview of the workshop to kind of give you an idea of how these things are going to come into play. But first we're going to define what synthesis actually is before we get into the idea of why do we synthesize, and then move into how we see and experience synthesis in our daily lives, because it's everywhere. We're always synthesizing. We're humans. We're putting things together. Moving into the actual mechanics of synthesis, as well as going through an actual example of a synthesis for two multimodal texts, two images. So we want to begin with talking about what it means to actually synthesize. To synthesize means to take existing content and put it together. You can think about what it means to be synthetic fabrics, synthetic periodic table elements, for example, things that don't exist naturally, but humans, we take things and we put them together. So A and B begets AB, or some new thing that is built from the elements of a previous item. So this idea of combining and putting things together to form something new, we can kind of put in conjunction with a new idea or other idea and say it's not to compare and contrast. We're not making a list of traits A and traits B and saying, see how they're different? That's maybe a step on the way to synthesis, to see where things don't overlap and where they do overlap. We'll talk about graphic images later, or Venn diagrams, for example, to help us see what that means to take things and to synthesize or find overlap, for example. But generally speaking, you can understand synthesis as taking some things, putting them together to make something new, to contribute. And so we ask the question frequently, well, why do we do things? Well, why do we synthesize? Well, on an everyday basis, we do it to make decisions frequently, right? The example I think I've heard most recently is using weather apps or Weather Channel or the local news, right? I, for one, don't trust just one forecast. I might hear something say it's going to rain later, so I open my app and see, is it going to run, or rather, is it going to rain? Is it going to interrupt my run later on? Or what information can I bring to bear so I can synthesize some new information, some new opinion on something? We take preceding information that exists, put it into conversation, and produce a new perspective. And so for our purposes, I've kind of put an illustration in the PowerPoint here, and you can see how analysis on the right side of this slide works. We take something and we take it apart. So in the analysis idea here is to take something apart and to make it into smaller parts. How is it built? Think about an iPhone teardown. How does that actually work to take apart a smartphone? You take it all the way apart and see how things are connected. So you're taking apart or dismantling things, you're analyzing. Lytic means to break apart, right? So here for synthesis, though, we're taking multiple things. This is the image on the left. This idea of how do you make things that are disparate or separate combine to join to form something new, right? So we do this frequently as humans on an everyday basis, like I say, just to make connections, to see how things work, to form new perspectives or opinions, to create new ideas, to draw more conclusions, to move forward. Think about how science works, right? If we didn't have some sort of synthetic idea of science, we'd have the same ideas we had 400 years ago. Instead, we get ideas, we take those ideas, we bring new ideas to those ideas, and we move things forward. Sometimes backwards, sometimes we stand still because science is built on failure, right? The idea, though, is that we want to further the conversation. So the common trope we use when we talk about academic conversation is, well, why do we do what we do? Well, for our purposes, when we research, when we build scholarship, when we talk about how to synthesize or why we synthesize, you can imagine this expansive river, this thing that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and where knowledge comes from. And whenever you're taking information, you can imagine that you're taking a bucket and just pulling information out at a certain point, using that and then putting it back into the water, but now it's a different new stream because you've contributed something new to it. So you're always taking previous or existing content. That's why you have such rich bibliographies and works cited pages, right? So you can look to see what did the people whom you're reading read to get to their ideas. That whole idea of nothing is really new, right? You're taking something that's old, looking at it, reinvigorating it, re-examining it, putting it to a new light, so taking a new lens that wasn't really discussed previously and applying it now, and you get something new, a new perspective. And then you take that conclusion or that perspective, and you're now contributing to the conversation to move things forward. We might even say to complicate things, right? So imagine you take something like salt and pepper. They're separate, they're distinct, you can put them together, synthesize them into a spice. So now you have salt, pepper, or something combined, synthetic, right? It doesn't exist naturally, and so we have to put it together to make something new as a contribution. So that all said, if we understand what it is and why we might do it occasionally, or whether it's everyday activity or scholastic, we can also think about where we do that. So we talk about lectures, literature reviews. Anytime you're in college, really, you should be synthesizing new information. When you come in as a first-year student and you leave as a senior or fourth-year student, or maybe go on to grad school, you can imagine you don't see things exactly the same as you had when you started as you do when you end. Why is that? What's changed? Has someone just poured information into your head, therefore you've learned information? Or is it something different? Is it something more that you've built onto, that you've shed from? You forgot something so you could learn something new, and you kind of continue to build and snowball. That's the idea of synthesis, though. That idea of everyday activity, of academic or scholastic activity to move the conversation forward. For our purposes, for these first-year writing courses, when we talk about synthesis, we're talking about reading at least 2 different texts, putting them into conversation, inventorying them for their features. So call back to that summary workshop video, right? What does it mean to summarize? You make a list of things, its traits, who wrote it, when was it written, in what context was it written, for whom was it written, what kind of language does it include? Oh, what's the subject? Is it a narrative? How did these things work? And you get lists of features or facts that help you to summarize it, right? Think of the rhetorical reading notes handout. Now put 2 of those same sets of reading notes together, and you can start to see overlap. Maybe it's in topic, maybe it's in purpose, maybe it's in context, right? And you start to be able to draw connections among those things. So when you start tabling these things, and this is kind of the hard part, no one likes taking notes, even annotating a text. So annotating a text, taking notes, this allows us to make lists. And when we get it outside of our heads, it's a lot easier to see connections. We're smart, we retain a lot of information in a very computer-like way, but to enunciate those for other person's benefits in our writing, that's our purpose here in the first-year writing course, to share that information, to be able to articulate it. And so you're trying to present that information in a way that illuminates or illustrates connections. And so when we talk about really how do we synthesize, we're talking about this idea of taking information, putting it into conversation, and forwarding a conversation. It's not compare and contrast. It's not summary, and it's not analysis. It's its own distinct genre. So at this point in the presentation, you can pause the video after I ask you this question, but I want you to consider for a moment, how is synthesis different from analysis or summary? And when you come back to the video and you press the play button again, or if you just keep going, we'll go through an actual example. Hopefully you've answered that question now, and you've thought about how does summary, analysis, and synthesis differ from one another. Pretty significantly, although in a connected way, right? So let's try out this concept here of a synthesis, to take information. So on your screen, you should see in front of you 2 different ads, both CoverGirl, and both very different ads, right? You get the right side of a face, 2 profiles, really. Drew Barrymore's a little bit more full-faced. But here you have Rihanna and Drew Barrymore on the cover of CoverGirl, and they're selling things. They're selling beauty, for example, makeup product, and there's this bit of difference though, right? They're not the same, they're not the same images. So when we put these 2 texts side by side, we can start to actually inventory their features. Okay, they're both advertisements. They both appear in CoverGirl. We might find out in which year and which month of the magazine each ad exists, so we can kind of compare the context of what's going on for each one of those, right? We can see what they're both selling. The one on the right selling DrewBarrymore.com materials. The other one, well, it says at the bottom, it's a little unclear though. Some other eyelash things here for Rihanna, right? And so we ask the question, how are they similar, how are they different? And we can really do that, and this is why we love graphic organizers. Writing things out makes things easier to see for us, because humans, if we differentiate our senses, we start to see things a little bit more clearly and crisply with circles and lines. So you have these 2 texts, right, the 2 ads, put them side by side, and we start seeing one is the image of Rihanna, a black celebrity, and then you have on the right Drew Barrymore, a white celebrity, both selling this classical image of beauty, of polish, of you need makeup to be pretty. So there are already overlaps. Now, scrolling back to these 2 images, and you can kind of see there's a lot going on here that is similar. So how can we make a synthetic idea here? Well, we table it, right? We put in this little Venn diagram, U and V circles. Image of a black woman, image of makeup for diverse people, diversity, image of beauty is the same. So how did we get there? Well, we took 2 two texts, two images here, and we compared them to make an observation from which we derived or synthesized a new idea. And here in this table then, we have the opportunity to kind of forward that thesis, to take two pieces of distinct information, find where they overlap, and draw some sort of conclusion to move it forward. Because once we do that, we can now be critical of, and we don't mean that in a pejorative way, to be critical of. That just means to think analytically about and to forward an observation about it in a non-summary way, right? So we can be critical of these images, and we can discuss how do magazines like CoverGirl discuss beauty or illustrate beauty. Is it through diversity? Well, how diverse is it? Yes, the images of the individuals are diverse, but is the idea of beauty diverse? Well, yeah, we get some range here, right? But we also get pretty thin women, both pretty young. These aren't older women. These aren't unmakeup women. It's celebrating something. So we kind of get this idea of how to be discursively constructive and conversational about this idea, and we take it and we can run with it now, because once we've summarized the text, once we've analyzed its features and its connections, we can start to synthesize new ideas. So as you're thinking about what it means to synthesize going forward and how you're going to do that, and composing a thesis, for example, think about how you can draw out and illustrate where texts overlap, what features they have in common, and then you can analyze how do those patterns work so you can synthesize some sort of so what value about something. So you can get to the idea of why does it really matter. And that tends to be a hard concept to approach in a first-year writing class because there's not a lot to really care about, it seems. Think back to your high school writing. When you get to that final paragraph of paper and you say, how hard is it to write a conclusion? It's so hard. And why is that? It's that so what? Why does it matter that this poet from the 19th century wrote this poem? It's hard to approach that so whatness. So as you're writing, you want to find something that matters to you, that you can examine, that so whatness. So that synthetic observation, that idea of how to put things together to be critical of, needs to have value, it needs to have context, and it needs to have some sense of significance or signification. And as soon as you can approach that, you will have this strong thesis from which you can argue, you can illustrate your point.